Okay, I'm going to hope to finish up talking about language today, and then this will be the only cognitive function that I think I'm going to get to. You'll notice that we did some of this chapter back when we talked about consciousness, so that module has already been done. And then it's a little bit sad, but I'm probably gonna have to skip over the decision-making part of the chapter. Dolphins also communicate with each other. They use a system of whistles and clicks. These whistles and clicks are used to communicate with each other. They're also used for echolocation, so sending out the click sound and then getting back the echo to see where objects are located farther away out of their field of vision. They also use these whistles and clicks to identify one another. So each dolphin will have its own name, basically. I'm going to play a little bit here. It's a really short little sound clip. I do usually talk a little bit about dolphins because they do appear to, I'm not going to say their language has syntax, but they do understand word order when we're actually the ones talking in our language, where, well, what people do is they gesture, right? And they can get dolphins to jump through a hoop and then do a certain dive, or you can get them to do a certain dive and then jump through a hoop. So they're very trainable, and they can do things in different orders so that they're clearly understanding word order, again, from our language, whereas we're really not understanding much depth of their language. I have this question about whether or not this is language. And I want you to kind of pause and think about that again, since you've watched the different videos of different animals. And you might decide that you really want a more clear and specific definition of what we mean by language, which most people, that's what most scientists have decided, that we really need to define this more specifically to be able to distinguish what we mean, between the difference between just communicating with like something like body language, which isn't really a productive language, versus real language. All of these studies of non-human language abilities, looking at these non-human precursors of language, give us a number of things. One is we can gain insights on how to better teach language to those people who don't easily learn it. So people with brain damage or people with autism. That's a more practical side. On the more theoretical side, they indicate that language evolved from a precursor that was found in other species. And we're going to talk a little bit, just a tiny bit more about this possible evolution. It also, again, illustrates the ambiguity of that concept of language, that we really want a more precise definition so that we can decide whether or not other species have something as complex as what we call language. And I usually spend quite a bit of time on this what is language question, and some of the specific aspects that different researchers have included as being necessary for us to call a communication system language. Okay, and so I think this is all from Charles Hockett. That is my memory, even though I just went and looked him up, and it was he has 13 and this is only 9, but this is my memory. So this was Hockett, and this came out in the 1960s. And I'm not going to read through all of these or try to explain them, because that's going to be another 10 minutes. But we usually have a nice in-class activity where we all explain these to each other and give examples and so forth. But I just wanted to put this up here as so you can see how much. So this is just one theorist, so that you can see how much people have kind of put into this, how much thought we've put into this question of what is language, what makes something a language. So as we see it, really human language is special. Just the amount of, from what we can tell, of what we understand of other languages, other animal languages. And now there are more and more recording devices that where we can hear dolphins and where we can hear elephants, given the recording device, translating that for us. It still looks like we have much more, especially of the productivity, generativity of what we can talk about. We can talk about really abstract concepts like truth and justice and things like this. So the question becomes, how did we evolve language? Basically, is it a byproduct of the evolution of our intelligence? It's just part of, because we became so intelligent, we created language? Or is it itself a specialized adaptation, that idea that it was, that language was adaptive in a way that, that influenced our evolution, that it came along for evolutionary purposes itself, as opposed to just being a byproduct. So he gives a couple of examples of whether or not it's a byproduct of intelligence. I have this kind of question because in some ways it really looks like no, it's not just a byproduct of intelligence. We see people who have normal intelligence but pretty severely impaired language skills. And in fact, getting at their intelligence, we have to see their intelligence in ways when we're not using language. This is on a dominant gene, and the example he gives is 16 of 30 people in a particular family over 3 generations are showing this. So this is clearly genetic, which doesn't really tell us anything about evolution, but what it does show us is that there are people who, if we test them in other ways, show a relatively normal intelligence with severely impaired language. And so I'm going to give you some examples that he has in the book, these kind of really typical measures of applying syntactic rules. So this is a wug, and they show 1. These are, and then usually we fill in wugs, right? Because we know that after a g sound, after that voiced g, that z, that sound is going to make it plural. And these people are responding, how should I know? And then later maybe, these are wug. This is a zat. These are zats, right? Again, we know how to apply the English plural. This is a sass. These are sasses. They're not doing that. They're saying these are zacco. These are sass. They don't know how to apply the basic English plural. They give them an item like, the boy eats 3 cookie. Can you see if there's something wrong with that? And they do attempt a correction. They can see something's wrong, but their correction is, the boys eat 4 cookie. So they're not, again, really applying the plural appropriately. As to, it's clear we're talking about a number of cookies. We also see the opposite, where people with impaired intelligence can have normal language skills. In fact, Williams syndrome, they have very skillful use of language. They appear to really like music and be good with rhythm oftentimes. If I remember correctly, they're extremely friendly, and they are very good at figuring out aspects of emotional expression, but they are very impaired when it comes to visual motor skills, any kind of task that relates to numbers, spatial perception. They give them the question of how long is this bus, or how big is a bus, and they're saying 3 inches or maybe 100 inches. They're really not very good at other aspects of what we see as being intelligence. And here's just one example again of somebody with Williams syndrome, a specific task, a visual motor task. Because she draws this elephant. On your left is her drawing. On the right is her description. You can kind of see she's labeled some of the drawing with language. And then she says what an elephant is. It is one of the animals. What an elephant does, it lives in the jungle. It can also live in the zoo. And what it has long gray ears, fan ears, ears that can blow in the wind, and so forth. So clearly her language is her language ability is quite good. And in fact, sometimes they use large words where they're not expected or required. He gives the example of, I need to evacuate this cup, as opposed to I need to empty this cup. Williams syndrome is another really rare disorder, something like 1 in 20,000. And it's traceable to the loss of a specific gene that is affecting some of those areas. If I remember correctly, it's the basal ganglia and the motor areas. But there's a lot more kind of between the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are doing a lot for us, so it's not just motor areas. But again, really showing that language does not appear to be a byproduct of intelligence, just that we've evolved this amazing intelligence, and so we ended up with language because we see both language without with impaired intelligence and intelligence with just impaired language. So a few other aspects of proposing this idea that language came about as a specialized adaptation, that language itself was adaptive. One is the language acquisition device that was theorized by Noam Chomsky in 1980, and also discussed quite a bit by Steven Pinker later on, that we are born with this language acquisition device that allows us to learn language, and that we're sort of bound to learn language. And some of this evidence comes from how easily children do learn a language. So regardless of what language I'm born into, I'm going to learn that language. I can learn several languages at the same time. If I have some bits and pieces of a sign language, and I don't hear anything, I can kind of run with that and create my own language. So children who are deaf and even are not provided any semblance of sign language, they will create a language and teach it to others when they're not provided one. So we have a real kind of social need to communicate with each other. There's also this fact that pigeons become creoles. So if we move to a new place, like let's say I'm French and I move to Louisiana, as they did at some point, that kind of pigeonizes as we are mixing different people who have different languages. They create their own new language to communicate better with each other, and eventually, at first this is a pidgin, as it's not completely its own language, but eventually it's going to become a creole, which is its own language. This appears to be, so I forgot that I had this in here, that this FOXP2 gene, that is actually what is affected by people with Williams syndrome. So they have the gene, and it has a couple of different amino acids in different places. And we see this same kind of thing. I can't remember in which primate, but I think it's chimpanzees, where they have the FOXP2 gene, but it is different in certain amino acids that are affecting these language abilities. So affecting the basal ganglia, affecting the cerebral cortex, affecting the motor areas that are communicating to my articulators and my mouth and jaw, and some of those mechanisms of the mouth and the throat itself, as I was trying to give my example of chimpanzees earlier, and how our mouths and throats are kind of created in such a way that allows for really specific differences, like phonemic differences, to be created. It looks like the long dependence that we have on our parents, which is really pretty unique to humans. Again, some animals spend their lives with their parents or in these familial groups, but usually that's not the norm. And having this long dependence means a particular kind of social interaction among people that appears to have favored the evolution of language. And most theorists agree that something specific evolved to allow for language, so language evolved as being adaptive, and some theorists actually put it as that language ability, that adaptation, allowed for the kind of intelligence that we see. We don't know, of course, but that's one of the theories of kind of human evolution. And this same kind of adaptation would allow for music as well, again, according to many theorists. Language has a sensitive period where if we don't learn a language by the time we're 12 years old, we're very impaired in being able to learn any language at all. And if we've learned our single language, it gets more difficult after that time for us to learn a second language and a third language. It looks like there's no real clear cutoff of this is the time to learn. It's just if you learn if you're hearing it as an infant, it's going to be better than if you start hearing it at 2 years old. At 2 years old, you're going to be better than if you start at 4 years old. 4 years old, you're going to be better than if you start hearing at 6 or 7, and so forth. There's a great study by Patricia Kuhl examining American infants and Japanese infants where they looked at these infants at 6 to 8 months old, and they could all hear and perceive the l, l, r distinction. So it looks really like we are born being able to perceive all the possible phonemes in the world. So Patricia Kuhl often says we are citizens of the world as infants, but it's based upon what we are hearing, what we are being exposed to. So for Americans, for English speakers, the l, the lr distinction is a phonemic distinction. It's a meaningful distinction in our language. And by 12 months old, it might have even been 11 months old, it's my memories, that by 11 months old, we are, American infants are getting somewhat better at hearing that distinction, perceiving that distinction, and Japanese infants, because that is not a phonemic distinction in their language, are getting worse at perceiving that distinction. Much of our understanding of the brain mechanisms that underlie language have at least originally come from the study of people with brain damage. Anymore, there are many different tasks and different sophisticated ways of looking at brain activity, but much of this comes from the study of people with brain damage, and especially for people who have aphasia, some kind of aphasia, which is a condition where there is a severe language impairment. The two most discussed forms of aphasia are Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. I'm just going to go ahead and get all this up here. Where Broca's aphasia is seen as being very disfluent, effortful speech. It's very halting. They have some short utterances where it looks, you can tell that they are struggling to get to their words. Relatively intact comprehension of other people, although some small difficulties in comprehension, but pretty good at comprehension of hearing other people. They have spared meaning, so they still have the meanings of words, which allows for that comprehension, and they have a real awareness of their deficit. So I usually show a video here, and I might end up showing it on Monday so that we can talk about it, because I think I'm running out of time, and we can compare Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias. So sometimes this is talked about as a disruption or impairment of form. Wernicke's aphasia, I'm just going to show you a brain in a second that shows that Broca's area is up there towards those motor areas in the frontal lobes, or the left frontal lobe, and then Wernicke's area is in the left kind of temporal lobe And we sometimes talk about that area, or I do, as the mental lexicon of holding our mental dictionary. These people have very fluent speech, but it's described as being empty, as it's often kind of gibberish. And again, I'll give an example then on Monday. They have spared grammaticality, so they have this fluent kind of, just like I'm talking, but what's in here is the high frequency function words, and the thes and ands and buts are all fine, but within that, the nouns and verbs are often just nonsense. They have utterances of normal length. They have poor comprehension of other people, so we see impaired meaning. And so it's not just that I'm not making sense when I speak and I'm talking this kind of gibberish, but I'm not understanding or comprehending other people as well, because the meanings of words are gone. And they're often very unaware. So they are unaware of their deficit. They're talking as if they are making sense, and they are not making sense. So here the question is it spared meaning? And this really looks like Broca's is pretty much about the form, the overall syntax, and just this reaching for words, but the knowledge of words is there. Wernicke's is just really the meanings of words are what they are lacking.